Welcome to the campus of North Idaho College and today's broadcast of the North Idaho College Public Forum. The crew is comprised of North Idaho College television students. Your moderator is North Idaho College political scientist Tony Stewart.
This past week, we have been dealing on our campus with a topic entitled The Future is Now. And some of the speakers during that program are discussing where we've been in the past, where we're in now, and what the future may hold. One of our most distinguished guests this week has been Dr. William Irwin Thompson, who is our guest on the program today. And we'll discuss this topic as he receives questions from the panel. Dr. Thompson is the founding director of the Lens Foreign Association. As to educational background, he holds a BA degree from Pomona College and MA and PhD degrees from Cornell University. He has also been an assistant professor of humanities at MIT, a professor of humanities at York University, and visiting professor of religion at Syracuse University. He has published 6 books and numerous articles. Among his books that have been published are such works as At the Edge of History, Passages About Earth, and a book entitled Evil and World Order, as some examples. Dr. Thompson, welcome to our program.
Thank you.
Joining with me in questioning our distinguished guests are 3 panelists. They are Robert Rogers, Lou Reed, and Robert Singletary. We'll proceed to questions at once from Robert Rogers.
Dr. Thompson, in reading some of your works and in listening to you, I'm fascinated by the terminology that you use. You talk about the coming world order as being having a new I've been practicing this word, becoming mythological again and sacred again and re-enchanted. And you use words like implosive and explosive and arcology. And I'm wondering if you could just talk a bit about what you mean by those terms as an introduction to your thought, and also give us a glimpse at what some of the new mythologies you think will be.
Well, I think in dealing with these words, you have to see me sort of like a junk sculptor. That, you know, there's the lovely, where I grew up in LA, there are the lovely Watts Towers, in which Simon Rodia has taken bits and pieces of 7-Up bottles, hubcaps, statues from the radiators of old Packard cars, and put them all together in this really lovely kind of Baroque configuration. And I'm sort of taking what's given to me by my environment. I live in a world of, as we all do for that matter, in a world of information, of poetry, music, films, ideas. And so sometimes the words that I'm taking, whether it's arcology or remythologizing or things of this sort, are words coming from other people's work that I then try to juggle with and put into a different kind of configuration. So Bultmann talked about the demythologizing of Christianity. The sociologist Max Weber talked about the 20th century as a period of disenchantment. And so when I look out at the period of postmodernism, after that period of 1900 to 1973, 67, pick your year at the other end, I see an opposite movement coming about, one of remythologizing, where the interest in Oriental mysticism or the interest in Gnosticism or the interest in anthroposophy and the theosophy of Rudolf Steiner, all these different spiritual quests and explorations are remythologizing, searching for mythos, and in a sense re-enchanting the world in which we live in. And so the evidence that I see of this about me are in the work of contemporary artists or contemporary spiritual communities. So places like the Findhorn community in the north of Scotland interest me because it's a group of people going back to Celtic animism and saying the little people really do exist, and they're coming at it in circumstances where they have advanced electronics in their community. They're not trying to go back to nature in a 19th century way, and yet in a very outrageous way they talk about angels and elves and little people and nature spirits in the way that someone would in India or an American Indian. And so that's a quality of remythologizing and re-enchantment and spellbinding, and it fascinates me. Other aspects are quite different, would be Paulo Soleri's community in Arizona, where he's trying to take the visionary philosophy of evolution of Teilhard de Chardin and use it as the kind of philosophical basis for building a city of a very different kind. There are examples of remythologizing in the interests of Americans in Buddhism and the popularity of the Tibetans coming to this country and setting up various teaching centers. So when I look at the whole thing, or the work of contemporary artists, like the ones I mentioned this morning, like the novelist Doris Lessing, the poet Gary Snyder, the filmmaker Werner Herzog, in his kind of religious films like Kaspar Hauser or Heart of Glass, I see qualities in which the sensibility of the age of anxiety, of all the cliches of modernism, of alienation, of angst, of the absurd, that these really don't characterize certainly my generation. And I'm 41, and I grew up in a very different historical epoch than all of that period between the two world wars. And growing up in the West and seeing East and West coming together, I see a very different kind of culture emerging than the international modernism of the previous 1900 to 1950. And so I have to use different words for it. I call it planetary culture rather than international culture. And I see it as one that's much more interested in meditation and the esoteric than the generation of my teachers in college, for example.
Lou Reed.
Well, you connect that with another phrase that you were using with the students, which is cultural transformation. And you said this morning that important events of history are invisible, and a cultural transformation is larger than any one single event or a chain of events. And I think it would be helpful if you did say what you meant by cultural transformation and how it ties in to the whole question of myth and resacrament.
Well, I think a period of cultural change is more than a change in the content of what people believe. It's a change in the structure by which they and society organize knowledge. A cultural transformation would be one as large as from being a hunting and gatherer to agriculture, or from an agrarian civilization to an industrial one, or even within agrarian cultures from a medieval worldview to one that was based on economics and science and technology, and moving from alchemy to chemistry, or moving from adoration to analysis. So that's quite a change in the organizations of one's perceptions or consciousness. And I feel that when one looks out over the historical landscape and sees the relationship of the miniaturization of technology and computer chips and the expansion of consciousness in the consciousness-raising movement, or the fascination with meditation, the culture is realizing that we no longer live in nature, we live in a world of information. And therefore, the polarities of that world of information are, say, mysticism and electronics. And there are some bridges that people build between those two opposed worlds, as in, say, the cybernetics of Gregory Bateson, who is both very sympathetic to Zen Buddhism and very sympathetic to Taoism, but also has his roots in Western science and in biology and anthropology. So that seems to me more than just simply a change in the content of information in the way that knowledge would change from the 20s to the 30s. It seems to be a cultural transformation, and someone like Gregory Bateson himself would write a whole critique of industrial civilization and say, we're in an incorrect adaptation and we're headed toward genocide unless we dramatically change our entire culture. So his critique is calling not for simply piecemeal fixing here and there, fixing the flat tire and getting the car back on the highway. He's talking about the whole role of the car and the nature of highways. And it seems to me that there are many, many writers, poets, thinkers like that. And many of them are centered in California, as Bateson is, or Gary Snyder. And I grew up in California, so I guess I've been greatly influenced by that moment of time.
Well, do you think we look to myths and periods then of crisis, that this is a way of going back and trying to reinterpret where we're going?
Well, I think myth is, I would look at myth in the Platonic sense, that myth is the highest form of knowledge, it's mythos, and that a culture first changes its mythos, and then it moves down to a period of artistic expression of the mythos, and then down to a period of political and technical scientific examination of the mythos, and then the last stage is the political organization of the myth. And then finally, when the political organization of the myth has been organized and the myth is thoroughly routinized, then in the Viconian spiral it spins round again, and there's a re-mythologizing and a whole different vision of nature, self, and society, or the nature of consciousness and values. And then in the early stages of that movement, it only exists as mythos with the prophets, and then it slowly moves down to the artists. We're right now in the steps in, say, the mythos of planetary culture, where it's moved from the prophets, the Chardins and the Sri Aurobindos, now into the level of the artists. So the major voices of our time, of this new global planetary culture, would be poets like Gary Snyder, novelists like Doris Lessing, composers like Stockhausen.
In that progression, then, you feel that the myth itself has pretty much been delineated?
No, it's very active and creative and changing, and of course there's a lovely play back and forth of artist and artist, so that what Gary Snyder would say and what Doris Lessing would say, they interact in the culture, and there are all kinds of permutations, and younger writers or even older ones will respond to that and make different religious kind of visions. One of the things that I think is happening in our society in terms of art is that because we're in a cybernetic society of electronics and in an environment of information, that nonfiction has become an art form. And so that when I sit down to write a book, I don't write it with the consciousness that I might have 15 years ago if I were an academic writing a scholarly dissertation. I see nonfiction more as an art form in and of itself, what I like to call Wissenkunst, which means knowledge as an art form. Wissenschaft means science. Wissenkunst means knowing art. And so when I look at Lewis Thomas's Lives of the Cell, I see a colleague at work in nonfiction as an art form, and we know one another and we respect one another's work. So we operate sort of. He is scientist turned writer, and I'm sort of historian turned writer. And if you look at history from a point of view of cultural change, then it seems to me that there are cultures with characteristic genres. In a warrior agrarian society, you have the epic, and so you would have an Iliad. When you move to a mercantile bourgeois middle-class society, into industrial culture and out of aristocratic society, the epic is no longer the dominant art form, and it becomes the novel. When you move out of an industrial into a cybernetic society, where you move away from materialism to information, then it's nonfiction itself that becomes the art form. So you get the reviews of non-existent books by Stanislav Lem, which is a marvelous, playful kind of book that the novelist, interestingly enough, Joyce Carol Oates, looked at it and she said, oh, these are the sketches for the novels he would have liked to have written, but he never got around to it. Total misperception of what he was up to. He wasn't trying to be a novelist. He had created a new genre, and in writing reviews of books that don't exist, he was playing with knowledge and writing a different genre. In the same sense, in the scholarly fictions of Jorge Luis Borges, there's a different kind of genre that's appropriate. So I think things like Passages About Earth, At the Edge of History, Lives of a Cell, some of Castaneda's work, that these are all genres of writing and show what happens to literature in an electronic society. It doesn't disappear, but it plays with knowledge in a very different way, so that the bard used to stand around the fire and tell stories about the tribe. But if you live in a world of ideas and information, then the bard has to tell stories about ideas and novels. So like this morning, I'm juggling all kinds of things around and putting them into different junk piles. But that's more analogous to the traditional role of art than it is to being Professor Thompson at MIT, analyst of industrial society. Very different role change, because I'm living in a different culture.
Robert Singletary.
You have a great deal to say, Dr. Thompson, in your writings and somewhat in your lecture this morning about education, the problems of education, and alternatives to contemporary education. And you mentioned one of the major problems that you saw was that our institutions, and specifically education, is somewhat out of sync with what you call the patterns of human growth. And in one of your books, you mentioned and broke down those patterns of what you call the natural patterns of human growth. Would you mind reviewing those? I found those very fascinating, and specifically relate them to education.
Probably I wouldn't remember, because the funny thing about me is that a book is an act of discovery, and then when I've codified it and put it into form, then it's over and finished, and I move on to different territory. I'm a very restless soul, and I can never stand to stay in the same place very often. But what did happen, so I have all these stages of Homo ludens and Homo faber alternating in a kind of spiral, like a DNA spiral through life. And this came to me as a teacher, because I found that we had created a linear society in which education was a straight line, and here was kindergarten, and here was the PhD, and you were just supposed to go in a straight line and behave yourself. But that if one looked at the way consciousness worked with a 7-year-old and a 9-year-old and a 19-year-old and a 39-year-old, it wasn't a straight line. There was a much more complex curve, but our institutions were trying to violate that in a kind of Procrustean way and crush everybody into this kind of same mold and bed, and that they were totally out of sync with what was happening with people, especially with young people who I felt really did not want to go directly from high school into college and would go through all kinds of shenanigans and do all kinds of absurd things in college to register their protest, when what they really should do is just drop out. And then when one discovered people in the midlife change who were going through a much more dramatic transformation and were bored with just working in the same corporation that they had been for the last 20 years, that they went through a marvelous kind of process of rediscovery and transformation that, if they didn't resist it and understood it and went along with it, offered a whole new rebirth of identity. But basically these don't fit society, because society will say, we don't want to have housewives in our law schools. We don't want to have housewives in our med schools. We will not take any applicants except those who are from 24 years of age to 26. After that, it's a cutoff, and we don't even want to talk to you. Schweitzer actually went to med school when he was about 42, so there is a case that sometimes people can do well in med school when they're over 40. And so we just say we only want these kids, but these kids have been also over-tooled and over-specialized, that they're not the best students and they're not the most humane doctors. And they move into a kind of treating the body as a machine and become sort of biomedical engineers rather than family physicians. So if we were to open our institutions and say there is a pulse and a rhythm and there are curves to life, and we will open our medical schools and law schools to women who are 38 or 44, and we won't just say it's a snob thing and we don't want to have housewives. Or we will take a guy who's worked for 20 years as an executive and he's bored to tears and he wants to do something else. I've talked to businessmen who say, if I had my life to do over, I would not work for a bank where I spend my entire day repossessing pickup trucks from impoverished Mexicans. I would do something that benefits humanity and has something to the common good of the whole human race. And they're at that kind of age where they're tired of the marketplace, they're tired of making a buck, they're tired of stabbing their neighbor in the backs, and they would really like to study medicine or health or holistic medicine, or move into law in a more supportive and helping way, rather than just corporate law as we train these hotshot 22-year-olds to work for, Park Avenue corporations. So I think none of our education is responsive to that pattern. So they're just completely, egocentric, imperialistic, and introverted. And I think this, has to change sooner or later.
Dr. Thompson, in your book, At the Edge of History, I found some very fascinating chapters and work concerning about our own country, and comparing the traditional way that we have known, and you give the city of Boston as an example, and the new way, Los Angeles, which you seem to be fascinated with.
I grew up in L.A.
Grew up there. Could you, for our viewers who have not had that privilege of reading your book, describe some of the changes this is bringing, not only to this country, but the plan as you indicate, I'm speaking political changes or social changes or economic changes, and for the traditionalists who finds it difficult to cope with change, how are they going to deal with this?
Well, I think what I was studying, Edge of History was written about 10 years ago, and so what I was studying, in a sense, was the archetype of a consumer society and affluence that began to influence all other American cities, because if you're in the Research Triangle at Chapel Hill, or if you're in Route 128 around Boston, or if you're in the highway strip around Anchorage, Alaska, you find the same kind of attempt to clone Los Angeles and have a highway strip, a shopping mall, and a cluster campus located to the shopping mall. And so the consolidated school district, the corporate industrial park, and the cluster campus all become one sort of integrated complex of post-industrial society. Well, that was basically conceived in California, and it's been exported and imitated in Tehran or Melbourne or Sydney or wherever one wants to go around the world. And it's a world that's based on cheap and abundant fossil fuel, and it's a world that now we can begin to clearly see that the Los Angelesization of the planet won't work, and that it basically isn't a good idea anyway, and that it's tended to destroy the integrity of small towns, so that you have the old decaying center of the town, and then you have the highway strip with the fast food takeout chains and the gas stations and the rest of it. So that was the image of progress and development for the mentality of the generation older than I am, and now I think it's being questioned. And so I think Los Angeles is, in a sense, the the archetype of the mushroom boom growth of 1945 to 1973. But I would definitely say that I don't think Los Angeles is the city of the future, that I think Doxiadis' ideas of creating a one global planetary city of ecumenopolis, as they called it, in which 98% of the people would live in the city and just machines and 2% of the people would produce the food, that's an absolute fantasy and it's not going to happen. So I'm much more interested in the village and turning on the spiral, and with electronics and with television and electronic decentralization, going back and rediscovering the pre-industrial village and showing ways in which an electronic return and recreation of the village is actually a very viable sort of thing. And a return to the kind of classical city of the size of Florence is more viable than cities of the size of New York, Los Angeles, or London. Many of the great cities of history have been quite small, and Paris in its great day was not the giant city that it is today. And so places like, Bern or Basel or Dresden or Florence, these have been great cities with high culture, but we've tended to think in the post-war era that only megalopolis is really civilized, and so everyone has tried to imitate that pattern, so Houston and Dallas become like Los Angeles. And I think that pattern is over. And
as you've indicated in your works, all of these stages that we go through and periods and influences, when the new change comes, it somewhat integrates with and keeps some of those things. What I'm attempting to ask is, the Los Angeles experience that we've had will have left some impact or effect behind concerning, I know in your work you point about the family and the change there. Are there going to be some positive and negative, too, results that are actually going to stay behind from this as we move on to another stage?
Well, it's quite true that in every stage, unless it's a period of apocalyptic destruction, every stage tends to incorporate the previous stage, so that if we move into an electronic decentralization and move away from capital-intensive economies of scale and the factory system in the Los Angeles version, that Los Angeles would probably restructure and reassemble its parts into a different whole. Well, it has to, because people drive 50 miles to work, and that's just simply not going to go on in the future. And so the workplace and the home place are going to have to be brought together. Well, that's absolutely in violation of the Los Angeles way of life. You live in the north of the San Fernando Valley, and you drive to Los Angeles, and it takes you, and you spend an hour and a half to sometimes even 2 hours in one direction. So some people will spend 3 to 4 hours a day in a car. And so they'll compensate with that by listening to the radio and listening to talk shows and things of that sort to overcome their loneliness. Now, that's simply not going to be viable. So regional assembly and nucleated neighborhoods and more steady-state neighborhoods are going to have to evolve. A very good book that's described that scenario, written by a Californian, is Warren Johnson's book, Muddling Toward Frugality, where he shows the transition from the traditional affluent, wasteful California economy and the new economy of the future that's more in keeping with energy and resources and limits of resources. Because we're not only running out of oil. I mean, we've got, there's a shopping list of all the major world's resources, and they all have deadlines for when they run out. So whether you're talking about aluminum or phosphates from Morocco, you're talking about resources that simply cannot be consumed at the rate in which we're consuming them. If we look at the rate in which we used energy in the 60s, it's incredibly more extravagant now. We haven't increased the level of civilization since the 60s. All we have done is to shift to a polyester world of throwaway plastic, and that just it can't go on anymore.
Robert Rogers.
I want to ask you about yourself. In one of your books, you have a quote, not yours, saying, "I've always felt that it's better to be esoteric from within society than esoteric in some mysterious, hidden away place like the Himalayas."
Oh yeah.
And I also know
Von
that you've done
Weizsäcker
some.
said that.
I also know that you've done some time in Manhattan, which is about as urban as you can get. How do you live? How do you try to pull that off in your own life? And how would one who lives in that kind of environment?
I live the same life in Manhattan or in Crestone, Colorado. I get up and I have meditation in the morning devoted to writing, and I write 5 pages a day. And so no matter what happens, whatever the burden of administration or fundraising or organization or correspondence is, I simply don't refuse to deal with the world in the mornings. And the phones don't get answered, so if people call up Lindisfarne trying to find it, they find out that we don't operate in an office of 9 to 5, that the phones are not answered in the morning. Then then whether I'm in Manhattan or Colorado, then I simply, in this case, I bike back up to the mountains from my study to my house, but in Manhattan I just wouldn't change rooms. But then I join the rest of my colleagues and associates, and then have an extroverted period of answering the phones, of writing correspondence, of doing all the administrative work. And then we come together for a communal meal, and then meditation at the end of the day, and then in the evenings are devoted to classes or seminars. So there's a rhythm in which there's either physical labor and alternating the chores, of whether it's cooking or construction or reconstruction as it was when we were in Manhattan. And the rhythm is very much a kind of monastic round that tries to deal with the body, the heart, the mind, and the soul, and do all of those in a single day, rather than putting it off and saying, well, tomorrow I'll meditate, or tomorrow I'll write and be creative, because I'm too busy today. No, it's very much that if anything is important, it's important to do it in that day. So there's always an attempt to deal with writing and not say, gee, I wish I had time to write, but I'm so busy I don't have time to.
Do you think that's paradigmatic of the guy who punches a clock? How would he do it? How would you live in an alternative way? What are some ways you could get?
Well, if the guy has a 9-to-5 job, which I had, I worked my way through college, and he really, you hear a lot of people say, gee, I wish I had time, I'd really like to write. That's a lie. That's an excuse. If someone really wants to write, they'll get up 2 hours early in the morning, and they'll write 2 or 3 pages a day, and then they'll go to work. It's nothing that's particularly exclusively for monks, but it is the canonical hours of the monastery, and I think it's just a more productive and creative way. Whereas in the university, of course, they won't let you do that, unless you don't go to the university. So you've got committees and this and that, and it tends to take a hold of you and gobble you up. So you have to gain control of your own life. So you have to make some decisions of saying, no, this is the best way for me to work.
Agreed. We have about 2 minutes.
What's it going to take to get to this next step of the decentralized contemplative life? Do you feel that there will need to be a catastrophe, or will necessity actually make it come to pass?
Well, I can see either scenario. We can go on as we are, and therefore just the normal pressures of the marketplace and the escalating cost of fuel will force us to change. In the old days, a bull of a watch would be given a flight of 23,000 miles around the world, going around tariffs and tax barriers. So you might assemble one part in Guam and another in Mexico and introduce it in the market finally in New York or L.A. If you counted up the jet fuel oil cost that watch cost when it was finally introduced into the market, it would be more than the price. That kind of production can't happen. So we have to switch to regional production, so that automatically you're beginning to get decentralization. So I think that just post-industrial society playing out its contradictions is encouraging its opposite to come in, which is a very ancient mode of thought.
With that, I must interrupt. I'm sorry we're out of time. We have many more questions we'd like to ask. Thank you for being with us.
Surely. Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, our guest has been Dr. William Irwin Thompson, who is the founding director of the Lens Foreign Association, speaking with us today about the future and the changes that are coming. Please be with us again next week. I am Tony Stewart.
The North Idaho College Public Forum can be seen at this same time each week over this station. This production was videotaped earlier by a North Idaho College student crew for viewing at this more appropriate time.